Okay, guys, here we go. This is our second DLD day, and we're still talking about why the Europeans were so able to conquer the Americas when they came into contact with them after Columbus arrived. And we talked about two factors yesterday. One, germs. 90% of the population of the Americas was probably wiped out by diseases that the Europeans brought over with them, and the Native Americans did not have any immunities for them. So basically, that emptied the continent. The other thing we talked about were technology advantages, especially steel. So they used steel to make swords, they made steel to make armor to protect themselves, they used steel to make a harquebus, so they had crude guns which if they didn't hit people, at least they made a lot of scary noise. They used steel to make plows, so that was important when they started converting the economy to a farming economy. Um, and they had the advantage of writing. They had better ships for transport. They could move a lot of people, not a lot of people, but many people and equipment from Europe relatively quickly. Now, the last advantage they had was in the area of food. So, from the earliest point that Columbus arrived on his second voyage, they start dropping off horses and cows and pigs, and they start planting wheat and barley and sugarcane, especially the sugarcane, because as we discussed, that becomes the cash crop in the Caribbean islands. Now, what happens is, in each case, these animals and plants begin to displace the native animals and plants. And in many times they destroy them, the native plants and animals that the Native Americans had been relying on for millennia for their food. So, for instance, the pigs that the Europeans unloaded, they would eat iguanas and they would eat shellfish, and they would root around and they would get the sweet potatoes that they had never seen before in the wild, and they would root those out. The cattle took over the grasslands, and the horses just exploded in population because there was so much grass. And in the end, what happens is they crowd out the Native American uh, plants and animals that the Native Americans relied on for food. Now, in some cases, that's not the case. So, for instance, especially corn and potatoes and beans and squash, we see those, the Europeans figure out how to use those on their own. Other animals, rats and dogs and cats, are now loosed in the environment. And it means that they're out there, they're in the wild. Rats in particular pass diseases on. Okay? So now let's look at what it was like. So those are the advantages that the Europeans had. Let's look at what it's like when they start to come into contact. The first one that we want to talk about is, of course, Christopher Columbus in 1492. He's landing in Hispaniola, and as we've seen, and I'll have another map here for you in a second, as we've seen, he's coming on board. He's coming on board and he's landing in Hispaniola, and later he's going to go to Cuba. He's going to go to Puerto Rico. He's going to go to the coast of Central America where the Mayans are. He's going to go to the coast of South America. Now, at this point, you should be looking at the the slide that says First Encounters on the top, and it's describing Columbus, okay? So you want the slide that says First Encounters. What happens when they arrive is, remember, there's two motivations. One, we're going to convert the natives to Christianity, and two, we're going to try to find a way to make money. So what do? They attempt to convert the natives. Some do convert. Some of them have no idea what's going on, and the Catholic priests will claim that they've converted them. maybe they convert, but then they quickly go back to the way that they used to believe. And the Spanish would persecute them then. The Spanish were very rough. One of the things that they looked for, once they figured out that they were not in India and there were no spices to be had, they discovered that there's gold. Okay? Now, they found a little bit of gold in Hispaniola. They found a little bit of gold in Cuba. And when they start asking the natives, where's more gold? The natives tell them, to the west, to the west. Now, part of the reason is that it's true. They apparently had contact with the Aztecs and they knew that the Aztecs had accumulated a lot of gold. Nobody in the Americas thinks of gold in terms of like the Spanish do. The Spanish think of gold as money. The Native Americans just think of it as something decorative, like we would. So they'll use it to decorate buildings, they'll use it to make jewelry. For the Spanish, it has a totally different um, meaning because they can melt that gold down, they can make money. And once they have money, now we're getting really rich. This is something we can send back to Spain, and everybody's going to be happy. So they start asking the natives, where do we find this stuff? And sometimes the natives can tell them, and sometimes they can't. And sometimes the natives are punished when they can't tell. And sometimes the natives respond by attacking the Spaniards, and the Spaniards put those rebellions down brutally. They enslave the natives, they force them to work in terrible conditions. Many of them are dying off and they're still trying to convert them. And when they find them doing things like practicing their native religions, they will accuse them of witchcraft. You know what we do with witches, we burn them. Okay? Remember, these guys are coming out of Spain. Spain has just finished the Reconquista, and these guys become known as conquistadors. Okay, the Spanish in the New World we call conquistadors. Okay, so if you look at the next slide is a map. I've got two maps in a row. The next slide is going to show you a map that has Columbus's journeys to the New World. So look in particular on that one, the blue, um, the blue one. We went on this, and you put this on your map the other day, and then if you follow the next map on the next slide, you'll see it takes you in a little closer and shows you how he traveled on that first journey and hit Hispaniola and then went over to Cuba and eventually returned to Spain. Okay, so I gave you the lowdown on Columbus last time, and Columbus ends up never finding what he thought he would find. Columbus never finds a way to make a lot of money. He gets in trouble with the people who invested in his expeditions. He gets in trouble with the crown. He has people back in the court in Spain who are bad mouthing him. He ends up going home in disgrace, and he was imprisoned. Okay, but let's talk next about the conquest of Mexico. Because once we make the conquest of Mexico, all of a sudden, well, in the Caribbean islands, what they find is they can plant sugarcane, and that becomes a cash crop. But that's going to take a little while, and most of the time, they're looking to get rich quick. The next guy who builds on that is a guy named Hernan-Cortez. And in 1519, what happens is Hernan-Cortez, so we're on the next slide here. It should be Roman numeral 3, Cortez in Mexico. He essentially hijacks a ship and sails away from Mexico and sails from Cuba to Mexico. He sails to Mexico, and when he gets there, remember how the Aztecs treated everyone? Well, when he gets there, the tribes that are there are not happy with the Aztecs. Plus, you've had in Aztec mythology the story of a god named Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl is a fair-skinned god, and According to their mythology, Quetzalcoatl was going to sail away, but he said he would come back. Well, right away, they think he's Quetzalcoatl. So he and his 600 men get to travel pretty much freely into Tenochtitlan, where they're greeted by Moctezuma. Moctezuma is the emperor at that point, and he welcomes them as gods, and they sit in there. And basically, what they do is they hold uh, Moctezuma hostage, and they force him to tell the natives, collect all the gold you can get, help these Spaniards out. And then what happens is the Spaniards uh, begin to see the Aztec practices of human sacrifice, and they're appalled. So what do? They force them to shut down their temples. Now, let's stop and think. Remember, why are they sacrificing humans? We got to appease Huitzilopochtli. We got to make sure the sun god has his energy drink so he can fight his brothers and sisters at night. And if not, the earth is going to end. So uh, they are forcing Moctezuma to come out and give orders one day. And a big riot ensues, and the Aztecs start throwing rocks, and one of them hits Moctezuma in the head, and he's mortally wounded. They take him inside; he dies. Now they've got a real problem. They've got to fight their way out. They don't have Moctezuma. And if you read Bernal Diaz, the reading response on Bernal Diaz, he records how they fought off the island, how scary it was. Some of them got captured, and while they're fighting their way off the causeways, they see some of their colleagues dragged to the top of the temple and sacrificed. It just makes your hair stand up on end if you read his story. But they get out, and what happens is they're traveling back towards the coast. Well, the governor of Cuba has gotten angry, and he sent a bunch of men to arrest Cortez and bring him back to Cuba because he left without permission. Well, what Cortez does is he surrounds those guys and surprises them and says, look, nobody's going back for trial. Either you come with me or we're going to have a trial right now and you'll be executed. So what he does is he gets the assistance of these guys. Plus, along the way, he's picked up an interpreter named Malinche. That's her native name in Nahuatl. The Spaniards call her Doña Marina. She becomes an interpreter for Cortez, and she is really instrumental. He is able to recruit the tribes who previously had been conquered by the Aztecs. They rise up. They go with the Spanish. They return to Tenochtitlan. Now he's got an army of about 25,000. But what's happened in the meantime, in the months that have followed, guess what's happened in Tenochtitlan? Disease has broken out, and the population is wiped out and weakened. And now Cortez returns, and with the help of the native allies, he takes control of the Aztec Empire. Okay, so that's the conquest of Mexico.